Hello, my name is Lauren Casteel, and I am President and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Colorado, as well as honored to be a trustee of ABFI. Today, we have the distinct opportunity to begin to kick off a series called Voice, Vision, and Value. And this is a series about the leadership legacy of Black women, a web series where we unpack the cross-generational leadership experiences of Black women in philanthropy. This series is a part of Voice, Vision, and Value, is a digital narrative project created by the amazing Toya Randall to celebrate the historic leadership impact of Black women in philanthropy. Today's episode features Black women leading philanthropy through crisis to liberation. Our featured panelists will be Chanda Raker, Senior Vice President of Impact Minneapolis Foundation, Carmen James Randolph, Vice President of Programs, Greater New Orleans Foundation, and Katrina Mitchell, Chief Community Impact Officer with the United Way of Greater Atlanta. Katrina, Carmen, and Chanda are Black women. They are daughters, they are wives, they are mothers, sisters, aunties, and dear friends. They are leaders orchestrating justice and equity, centering operations and procedures with that lens inside of philanthropic institutions. They are leveraging political will and catalyzing community philanthropy to combat systemic racism and white supremacy in the fight for Black liberation. We are thrilled to have you join this intimate conversation with Black women leading this community-based philanthropy in these 3 American cities where Black people are disproportionately impacted by the global pandemic. They are also 3 cities in the midst of civil unrest, cities all struggling under the weight of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, as well as centers for us to consider what it means to be Black and liberated in America. Today, we will have several discussion themes. One will be their leadership. The other will be the unique characteristics or leadership that Black women may bring and how that is manifested, as well as the impact of COVID-19 on Black communities and individual institutional responses to COVID-19, civil unrest, and the protests that we are seeing around the country. Welcome to each and every one of you, Chanda, Carmen, and Katrina. Thank you for joining Voice, Vision, and Value, Black women leading philanthropy. I'd like to kick off with a little bit of personal reflection. This will be airing during Black Philanthropy Month. And if you could take just a moment and identify for me what Black philanthropy generally or historically means to you, not only from an institutional perspective, but also for you personally. Who wants to begin?
You know, Black philanthropy, it's really an interesting question. I am almost 3 years in formal philanthropy, and I think that what it means to me is growing day by day, the importance of our voices. I knew it before when I was leading a nonprofit, my ability to relate to the people in philanthropy in ways that I couldn't relate to others in philanthropy. They were inspirational. I felt confident that they were looking out for the community. And now what it means, especially with us women in philanthropy, is a sisterhood. It is what kind of gets me up and moving every day. And so I know that when there are voices at the table that have the lived experience, that have the connections to our community, to me, it means a deeper impact for all of our communities across the nation.
And how do you express philanthropy within your life outside of the work that you do? Or how do you see it show up within your family?
Yeah, so, I have a family that's been deeply involved in community. It's likely why I am also deeply involved in community. I've also always led outside of the institutions I've worked in. So I sit on a number of boards. I give to candidates. I give to organizations that I care about. I support leaders that I'm inspired by. And I am specifically committed to supporting emerging young leaders in our community.
That's wonderful. Carmen.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity. And it's it's great to be here with you all, my fellow sisters in philanthropy. I would say what it means to me, honestly, goes back to my early years, my beginning. I was brought up raised in the AME church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And as a child growing up in church and learning about the importance of tithing, the importance of giving, and not just only giving your dollars, but giving your time, talent, and treasure to the community, and understanding what that meant for a church community to be very active and involved in giving to its youth. When I was a child, we were there. My church at the time was a historic church in our community, and we were very tied to churches. So there was a lot of activity and activism that was going on with the children. We were encouraged to be a part of the NAACP. We learned how to speak publicly first in church. So a lot of that grooming for giving, for leadership, for thought, for me, was anchored in my experience growing up in the AME church. And I was blessed. I had both sides of my family in church, in the same church community. So I saw that reflected in my auntie and my grandmother and my cousins. We were all in the choir. One played the drums and the other played the organ and another played the piano. So that, for me, that experience of raising money for causes, coming together as a community to help a family in need who got burned out of their home, and this, that, and the other. That first was nurtured for me within the church. I would say as I got involved in the nonprofit sector and in formal philanthropy, there I realized the privilege in which we have sitting in these seats and the power that we have sitting in these seats to make transformation happen, to be able to make strategic investments in leaders and issues and causes, and to really help build up nonprofits. So I would say my experience in philanthropy, I was blessed to start my career at the Eugene and Agnes C. Meyer Foundation, which anchored as core beliefs that general operating support was a part of capacity building, and it believed in investing in leaders, and that the staff all had to be leaders. So that gave me the grounding and the experience to say, okay, what are the needs in the community that I know? And who are the promising leaders, those leaders of color that I'm going to make sure that this pivotal foundation makes its bets on? And what is the work that they are telling me that needs to be done? And how do we bring together the right resources to make that happen? So that grounding and that ability to see and make transformation happen at the community level, and really respecting, honoring the seats that we sit in and learning how to navigate them. That was my early experience in philanthropy, and I carry that with me today in the capacity that I currently serve.
Thank you very much. Katrina.
Sure, and I'm so grateful, good morning to everyone, to be here with you as well. For me, it started in my family. My grandparents emigrated here from Jamaica, West Indies, and we were always taught from very young to continue to give back. Even my earliest memories are of us pooling our money together and sending it back to Jamaica, right, to family members to support them. I remember packing barrels of clothes and materials and school books for family members back in Jamaica. You know, that lives with me. My great grandmother and my grandmother were so actively involved in their community, both in Jamaica and when they came to the States. And that is exactly where I learned it from. It was part of who I am, part of what I just knew was what to do. And just like Carmen mentioned, it was about that time, talent, and treasure. And so my experiences all have led to that. I had a chance to work at organizations like the National Urban League and the Children's Defense Fund and watch Black leaders every single day do some amazing work. And those were my models and my examples of what leadership looked like. I don't know that I really understood philanthropy per se until I had the opportunity to start my career in Atlanta at United Way and then go to the Andrews Family Fund in New York City to really understand the power of philanthropy. And just like Carmen and Chanda said, really think about our leadership, right? Our opportunity to really influence change and what that looks like. And it looks very different, but we have a power and a privilege that for me is important for us to use for good, right? And our opportunity to really change the landscape of what happens. And so this month, I think, you know, Black Philanthropy Month really allows us to celebrate that, right? Celebrate all the leaders that came before us and celebrate the opportunity we have, particularly in this moment in time. You know, I have 11-year-old twins, and I recognize that they are watching me every single day and watching my leadership so that I'm instilling the same values I had in them. And the power to give to your community and change your local community continues to be really important. And the other thing I would just say is that for me, you know, it is not a cliche that service is the rent you pay for living. And to me, that is, you know, what I'm here on this earth to do is to be of service to others. And so whether it's in philanthropy or nonprofit or whatever seat I sit in, that is the value that I hold very dearly to my.
Would you say that the Black community has ever not been philanthropic?
Yeah.
It is in our bones. It is inherent to who we are. It's how we have survived. You have each mentioned leadership. You certainly have the titles that would identify you as leaders. And you've talked about supporting emerging leaders. Can you talk to me for a moment about whether rebellion in any way, shape, or form, I've heard transformation, but is there any sort of quiet revolution, and how do you manifest that as a leader? So by way of example, Audre Lorde has talked about self-care as being a revolutionary act, an act of rebellion. I saw a beautiful, beautiful film about Black women the other day that's on Vimeo called Invisible Portraits. And they talked about the quiet, small acts. But for each of you, how would you define how you manifest your leadership, both within the community writ large and then institutionally? What is leadership to you?
I can jump in. I think, you know, leadership to me is how you show up every day. You know, it has to be authentic. It has to be who you are. It really shouldn't matter what seat you sit in, because I think you have an opportunity to lead no matter where you are. That to me is super important, because I think we give this misnomer that the title is the only way you can make change in an organization, and it's not, right? Change happens. If you think about, you know, all of our social movements of our time, many of the folks who did all of the work to really lead and make some really influential change didn't have high-powered titles, right? They were the folks behind the scenes doing the work every day, making those small, measurable acts that really make a huge difference. And so that to me is what leadership is. And I really believe that part of this is being authentically who you are and showing up in the same ways, no matter what setting you're in. And so I work hard to make sure that regardless of whether I'm in church or in the community or in my formal role, that I am who I am. My children are important to me. My values are not any different. And so I think to me, that's what leadership is. And that's the model that I, hope to follow and hope that others, follow, because I think that's really what makes the difference.
You mentioned also being a parent. And what I hear you saying is that you lead within your families. And a little bit I'd like to talk about as well, how we navigate the both ands, the and it's not just both and, it's and of our lives. Chanda.
Yeah, so I was going down the rebellion track, and I would say that, for me, it has been, and I think this is how my leadership is manifest, and I think this is how leadership manifests, right? When you see something that's not working, when you see something that can be improved, when you see people that aren't being treated as they should be treated, that you're willing to step in and have that conversation when everyone else is not willing to do it. I think it's a commitment to learning. I think it's a commitment to living into acts that are beyond the benefit of yourself. And, I would say that, every day or every table I sit at, I think if I can't feel my essence at the table, if I can't feel my leadership here, this isn't the place for me. If I'm walking away from the table with a lot of unresolved feelings, things that I didn't feel comfortable saying, behaviors I'm disturbed by, but unwilling to lead into that, to at least bring voice to how I think the table could be better on behalf of community, then I feel like I have not done my work, or it's not my table to do that, and then I have to move along. But I think that every day, and I know someone said just the act of us being at tables in some way is an act of leadership, because we sit at a lot of tables where we are the first or the only, and that is not for the weak or the weary. It is something that you have to stay committed to, because you know that there's a benefit to ourselves and to our community as a result.
Carmen?
I would say I agree wholeheartedly with everything that both Katrina and Chanda have shared. And I would add that I believe that leadership is also being clear about what you will stand, like being clear on standing your ground and on those issues for which you will take a stand, and what you bring to those issues. It's about being bold. It's about being bold and having the courage to take that stand or to advance. I remember very early in my career, I had my first capital campaign, and I was so excited because I hadn't done a capital.
Excited, not scared.
I was excited.
Yes.
And what was so exciting about this is it was for Covenant House, DC. And former Mayor Vince Gray was the leader of Covenant House at that time. And I had the most fabulous site visit with them, with Vince and his staff. And they asked the foundation for $100,000. And they told me that the staff had matched that already. The staff had matched that dollar for dollar. The staff had contributed $100,000. So, and in addition to that, they were raising money from other sources, and it was about building this building that now exists in Southeast Washington. And I took that to our president. I did the write-up. I'm ready to present this at the board meeting. And literally the week of the board meeting, the president of the foundation came to me at that time. She came into my office and she shut the door and she said, "Are you willing to fall on your sword for this grant?" And I looked at her, I said, "Absolutely I am." And she said, "Tell me why." And this is beyond the write-up and everything else, why I felt strongly that grant should be made. Now, you might ask, Were my white counterparts asked the same kind of questions? Were they held to the same standards? Were grants or capital campaigns led by, for organizations led by people of color received the same kind of rigor, or just, second guessing and what have you? But I was clear, and it's those kinds of moments in this field, I think, for all of us that define us. And yet it's also, to me, when you come across that leader in community, and we all have excellent ideas or excellent work that they're doing, they're totally committed, and they hand you materials or they talk to you about their work, and they don't have their stuff together, and they don't know how to present a budget, and they don't know how to make their case. And I've had many conversations, and folks watching this might say, yep, she said that to me. I said, baby, look, don't say this to nobody else. This is how you're going to present this information.
You're coaching.
The tools that you need.
You're coaching.
Your budget. Absolutely. Because I believe that any encounter with any of us should make you stronger to go out to the next person that doesn't look like us, and give you a chance of getting your work resourced and financed. So that, to me, is being a leader and showing up in this space. And it's that role of buffer that we play, that you have to stand up and say, yes, I'm going to fall on my sword. But then when you're in community, to say, okay, let me show you how this is done. There are things that I know, like Katrina, before I came into this space, I didn't know there were things I just didn't know. And, people don't know them unless someone is going to take the time and say, don't ask for more than 10% of your budget just coming out the gate. There are just things that we know from being in these seats that I feel we have a responsibility to share.
Philanthropy is known for making up terms, right? And trust-based philanthropy is something that's being talked about a lot. And you just demonstrated that. That is the essence of trust-based philanthropy, that you could have that authentic conversation in partnership, not in criticism, but that every interaction that is had is one of growth and mutual respect, and probably mutual learning. You had learned something as well from the group where the staff had raised that money. Like, what do you learn from that? That's incredible. So good for you. Thinking of coaching, there's a deep legacy of Black women in the field of professional philanthropy who have supported and poured their hearts into building the pipeline of Black women in the field today. I am honored to say that I benefited from the coaching of Lynetta Gilbert, for example, who would say to me, don't say that. You can say that to me, don't say that publicly. When you go in and fall on your sword, you may want to structure yourself a little bit differently. Albertha Penny, Retha Clark, King, Gladys Washington, Lynn Walker Huntley, like the list goes on, Etha Henry, Anna Faith Jones. Like, when I started, these women who embraced me 30 years ago fill my heart today. What do you feel or think of, or what names would you like to call out? Let's say her name for those who have paved the way for us. You've talked about standing on shoulders.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, you mentioned Dr. Retha Clark King. Certainly here in Minneapolis, she was a beacon, a light, a trailblazer, someone who I admired from a distance growing up. And then Karen Kelly Alarula, who was in my role at the Minneapolis Foundation. Both of those women attend my church. And I remember I remember just staring at the back of Karen's head, right? And saying, like, that lady does really good work. Like, I know kind of where she works. I don't really know what she does, but I know I want to do that. And I think about that often because I recognize the importance, again, of us being at the table and how we're inspiring leadership when we don't know it. How when you least expect it, somebody, a Dr. Aretha will reach out, or Karen will reach out and say, you know, here's what I know. This was my experience. Those things matter. The relatability, understanding how they navigate it. I just have just a great deal of respect and admiration. And I hope that I could do a portion of what they've done for me for others.
Other names that you would like to lift up?
No, I was gonna say you named two of the people who've been really important to me. One has been Gladys Washington. Many of us know her, but I think she has put her hands on many of us, and had to say, no, don't do it that way, or no, that's not how you do it. But it's always been in love, and I think for me, those have been the moments that have been really helpful for my career, when I felt like I just don't know if I can do this anymore. It was the encouragement from a Gladys that helped me know I could keep moving, particularly in Southern philanthropy, right? What does it look like in the South to do this work as a Black woman? And then the second person for me, you named her, was Etha Henry. I'm in this seat because of Etha. She worked at both the Community Foundation, and then United Way. And I left United Way and came back because of her. She created a role for me to come back, and she knew she was about to retire. And so her succession planning also included shepherding me into this role. And so I would not be in this seat if it weren't for her. All the work that she did prior to me stepping into this role is what has allowed me to be able to step into the moment that we're in now, and to do a lot of the change I've been doing for the almost 2 years I've been back at United Way. But again, she nurtured me, she was there, and she opened the door and created a role, right, to allow me to do this work, what I wanted to do, and I couldn't have imagined not having that. And so for me, the Black women, and there's so many others that I watch, and I think Chanda said it, you know, I want to be able to follow in those roles, so that I am very clear about being careful. People are watching, right, and paying attention to how we rebel, how we move the work, the decisions we make, how we show up in community. And I recognize that, you know, I don't just sit here because of me. I sit here on the shoulders of women who came before me, and particularly Black women who didn't have the opportunity to have the title Chief Community Impact Officer, right, and led in so many different ways in philanthropy that have really showed me the way.
Yeah, can I add too? Because often when I think about who's influenced, I think of older women. And I just have to give a shout out to Toya Randall. And Toya is fantastic. And, you know, I mean, Carmen, I think I met you, and I hadn't even started yet at the Minneapolis Foundation. And Toya knew that I was getting ready to go. And the Black Women in Philanthropy retreat was, I think, the weekend or the week before I started. And so I go down, I'm like, there's a Black woman in philanthropy, like there's a gathering. And so I was able to go into that retreat. I was able to listen. I was able to see faces. I was able from the beginning to see that, you know, in those moments that I think I'm by myself, you know, because there's a handful of us up here in Minneapolis. But if I ever felt like that wasn't enough, I could see the network that I could reach out to when I need to. And I knew that there are people fighting the same fights. There are women fighting the same fights. And I have watched Toya just be just a connector and a supporter of women, just, you know, tirelessly. And even in this conversation today that she's pulling together, and this new effort that matters so much and will reap benefits long into the future. So I just have to say the peer group is also important, right? It is what will keep you up and going and moving in the right direction.
I second that. Toya she leads with and from a place of love. And we often talk about love in this work and the power of love, but she cultivates love just amongst and between all of us, and she leads from that place. And I just second that, Chanda. She definitely
absolutely
connector extraordinaire. And in terms of some of the other names that I would call out, some you've mentioned, Lynetta Gilbert is one of my predecessors at the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And Lynetta paved the way. And when I think of Lynetta, I think of the question that she posed when she was the James Joseph Lecturer, and that is your vision big enough? And if you talk to Lynetta, she will challenge you. She will push you. She will push your thinking, and always with truth to the community. And Lynetta, as well as there was a woman in DC who I would say was one of the first to, like you, Chanda, those women that you just look to and say, wow, I want to be like that sister, and just have this going on and what she's doing and how she's moving things. And that was Terry Lee Freeman. Terry Lee Freeman was first at the Freddie Mac Foundation, and then she went on to lead the Community Foundation, CFNCR, of the National Capital Region. And she grew that from a small trust to a multi-million, hundreds of millions of dollars institution. And Terry always had the focus of community at the forefront of her work. She was bold in her leadership there, and always pushed and challenged the conversation. And that was something that, for instance, she led a series called Putting Race on the Table in her work there. And there was a sister that I worked very closely with, Ruby Coles, at the Mariah Fund, who is about to retire. And Ruby, we would say we made mischief together. Ruby,
Good trouble.
Good
yes,
trouble.
So why can't we go meet with the mayor? Why can't we go speak at city council? You know, there's a role for philanthropy to do these things, to be catalysts, to move, to push the agenda. And she was one of my great teachers. And I would say Gladys Washington, when I thought about the question, Gladys is like the compass. Gladys will always show you the direction, but she will not. I love this. She's the compass because she will point you in the right direction, but you have to plot your own course for how to get there. But as a fine compass, she'll show you this way is the way. You know, this is north. This is what we should be aspiring to. And really just challenge you to use your own knowledge, wisdom, integrity to get you there. And lastly, I would say Albertha Penny. When I haven't known Albertha long, but Albertha is like wisdom personified. And she's just one person that when Albertha is talking, when you have the moment to sit with her, you could just sit at her feet for hours and just soak in every word that she's saying to learn from her, because she's done this. She has traveled this course in Southern philanthropy, out West. I mean, she's done this, and all of her lessons she freely shares. And I'm just grateful to every last one of the women that I've named and more.
Yeah. Can I add also, Lauren, I think the peer group, I think Chanda talked a little bit that Toya absolutely is representative of that, but you know, I was a part of the Association of Black Foundation Executives Fellowship, and it was the most transformational time in my life, right? At a point in my career where I really wasn't sure philanthropy is where I wanted to be and whether my skill sets were suited. And I met 4 Black women that have been behind me, alongside of me, when I've cried, when I felt frustrated, when I didn't know where to go. That is Takima, Michelle, Jahan, and Kelly. And I have to name them because, you know, they're the folks that in the middle of the night when I'm not sure about something, I have to text, right? They're the folks that I can just pick up the phone and say, I need a consultant to help me with something, some work I'm doing. And I, you know, that group of Black women and all the other women who've been at the Women's Philanthropy Leadership Retreat are the folks that keep all of us going in lots of different ways. And so some of them are names we won't have time to mention, but some of them are people who, you know, have constantly been, I know, along my side through the ups and the downs. And I just want to echo that, because I couldn't do this work without that network. There's no way I could continue to be who I am without those folks behind me and alongside of me, pushing me along the way, and supporting me in ways that I can't even say thank you enough for, because it really has been what's continued to keep me moving.
And what's so beautiful about that network is that we all grow. We all grow, we all change, we move, but it still stays in place. And I would say that it's that network that has kept me grounded through a lot of life circumstances, challenges, as well as, girl, can I just call, and I had one of those yesterday. I had to call Sharice. Sharice, I got
Real talk.
so, I mean, but just to have those sisters who will set you straight, or say, girl, I'm a ball for you, or yes, that's how we gonna do with this. I mean, that is the blessing of this peer network, and the fact that we've grown and we help each other grow. We connect people, and we connect people to opportunities, and grow those coming behind us and around us. And it's very powerful and special.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to say her name. I hope it's something we continue to do, in particular around Black women, in so many aspects of our lives. I also have to admit, I'm sitting here feeling a little sad. I went to the first retreat, and I have not been able to go since, because it tends to be like within a week of our largest annual fundraiser for the Women's Foundation of Colorado, and it has always broken my heart. So this year I'm going to try to zoom in for part of it, just to be with you all. But I am sad that I have not personally spent more time, for example, learning from each of you, and I will continue to lift your names. But I do have Karen McNeil Miller in Colorado, which is powerful, powerful, powerful. We spend a lot of time on her couch or on the phone doing exactly what you described, Carmen. Let's move to the work for a little bit. Can you each talk about, in these times, COVID, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all of the names that we can lift that go back decades, that are at the heart of the racial protest, our sons and our daughters. How are you shaping an equity agenda within your institutions, and where have you found both support, the easy pathways, where have you had resistance, and how do you navigate that?
That's a question.
That's a question.
That is a
we
question.
Can break it up. Why don't you just first start defining your equity agenda, and how does it address anti-Black racism, and then and systemic racism specifically, and then we can talk about how that process may have had fits and starts along the way, and how it's affecting you as well in these times personally.
I could start by saying that, this moment was initially defined by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that being in itself a disaster. And what we know about disasters is that disasters, man-made, natural, or public health disaster, they only exacerbate pre-existing conditions. And this pandemic is no different in that regard. I would say that the work that we have done, and that I led at the foundation to develop a disaster strategy well in advance of this moment, and developing a disaster strategy that was grounded in equity, long-term sustainability, resilience, and civic participation has really laid the groundwork beautifully for us to make the investments that speak to the heart of addressing inequity in this moment and at this time. I can tell you that this strategy, just as an example, in 2016, the floods of 2016 that impacted a significant part of the state of Louisiana, mostly in the Baton Rouge area, we had the opportunity to do grant making that was, and we structured our strategy to be short-term as well as short-term immediate relief as well as long-term. And I'll come back to that point. But in the long term, we realized that in many cases across the country, this was true there, that in those low-lying areas where people were most vulnerable, that's where most people of color were living. And this is from a long history of redlining. And we were able to make an investment to help the Housing Coalition here in New Orleans work with the folks in Baton Rouge to change their whole housing plan for the community. So that is a way of how you can use the moment of disaster to be strategic to address long-term issues. Now, this particular disaster that we find ourselves in, it doesn't have, we're still in it. You know, this doesn't have a defined moment of gutting and mucking and restoring and what have you, and now long-term rebuilding. We are still in it. And one thing that is very clear, that civic engagement piece, that power building piece, has to be an investment that we're all thinking of and doing now. We had a local land trust housing organization organize an action here where people were literally down at landlord-tenant court, blocking the path of landlords to come in and file eviction notices for tenants. So we know that we're on the crisis, we're on the brink of a major eviction crisis, not only here in New Orleans, but all across the country. So many people are going to be forced out of their homes. And with 78,000 people and counting unemployed just here, the power building work, the policy work, the advocacy that has to be baked into how we are responding to this situation now. And I would say the last point there in terms of grounding equity, you know, we check our portfolio and hold true. Are we investing in leaders of color at this moment? Are we investing in women-led organizations at this time? And in investing in leaders of color, one of the grants that just was so dear to me, we have a group of young people, young adults who've come together and they have organized food distribution in the Lower Nine. And these are young folks. So to give investment to young people who are working in community at this time, holding true that you're investing in the folks who are closest to community and look like the community that you're trying to serve, and doing a balance of those kinds of investments, as well as those that are large, that are larger and have bigger impact. Like we have funded our FQHCs, which are all headed by people of color and serve collectively more than 100,000 people. And we know that's where the majority of folks who are able to access care. So to position them to be leaders in this moment is very important.
I would imagine that in New Orleans, that for you, there have been so many powerful lessons learned over time. And certainly in the context of Katrina, I had a chance to spend time in community with Lynetta in New Orleans not long after Katrina. And, you know, what I was seeing and hearing then about the role of community and civic engagements in so many levels, including the arts, including, you know, public life, nonprofit life, like across the board, neighbors, neighborhoods, women-led organizations, people of color-led organizations. So many powerful lessons were being lifted up. So thank you for sharing those more current examples. Katrina.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, we were already on this journey. So in 2016, 2017, Our United Way had adopted a child well-being frame. You know, Our United Way is one of the largest in the network. Obviously, we are positioned in Atlanta, but we also recognize that we wanted to really shift from a very, you know, direct service focus to really thinking about changing the systems. But we did that by looking at data. So we had developed this child well-being index and map that helped us down to the zip code level, look at all the things that are important for families to be well. So it's not just education, not just workforce, it's health, all the things that are important, those social determinants of health. And to really think about, you know, what does it mean to invest differently, right, in those organizations where there's the greatest need. The map and the work that we did told us two things, that place and equity were important, to have that at the core of our investments. And so it identified communities that, you know, which we had described as low and very low, having low and very low child well-being, but where those were all communities of color. Those were all communities that had been disinvested for years. And quite frankly, they were many of the communities who we hadn't invested in a very targeted and strategic way. And so for us, that was the start of the work. But that also meant that we needed some other supports internally as we moved down that road. And so we worked with partners like the National Equity Project to help us internally build our internal capacity. We also pulled together, you know, leaders in philanthropy to really understand what is working. So obviously the work in Arkansas and Sharice and others have been doing amazing work, but they were also helpful to think about what are the things we could do to shift our grant making practices so that we were thinking about a systems change approach rather than just individual or family behavioral changes. And so that had already been in motion. What happened in COVID is it just kind of accelerated everything that was already happening. I had kind of done a lot of work with my internal team to think about how we were going to shift practices. And so we had already been in the midst of that. But when COVID hit, quite frankly, just like Carmen said, it just exacerbated all the things we already knew. You can't get to child well-being if we're not focusing on the root causes, right? Those inequities that create systems that don't work for families. And so that, I think, was really where we started. What I think this moment did do for us as a United Way is to name race, right? You know, so we had talked about equity, but we had not explicitly named race, right? And so no longer could we kind of shy away from that, because those folks who were being disproportionately impacted by the effects of COVID, not just the health impacts, but all the economic challenges, were Black and Latino families in Atlanta and across the region. And so, you know, that is where we led. We also had our change in funding and how we funded more systems approach, but we had been a part of, for the first time, really the census work, right? And really being actively involved in doing census outreach and supporting organizations who are doing outreach to Black families and Black communities across the metro region who were potentially going to be undercounted. And so this really just continued to make that happen, you know, and then it threw us into the throes of us working in partnership with the Community Foundation to lead a COVID response and recovery fund. Two institutions where we really had to figure out very quickly how to make sure that equity is at the root of how we did our grant making, and also being very explicit about funding organizations who are led by and serving folks of color and being very intentional about that. And so that was a huge part of the work. And, you know, I'm grateful that we had already started there, because then when we were in this moment, my team and the rest of us were ready to step all the way in, right? So it was about funding, but I will also tell you it was about learning. You know, even in the midst of this, we did a survey of nonprofits who received dollars from the fund, who were led by and serving folks of color, and quite frankly, they're struggling. right? The day-to-day mental health of our leaders who are leading work on the front lines is challenged right now. Not only is the nonprofit sector really at a pressure point and in a pressure cooker, but those folks who, those of color, Black women, Black leaders who are on the front lines are struggling right now just to figure out how to make ends meet and what they're going to do tomorrow, right? And so this is our moment to be and look differently and really be able to respond very differently. And help influence the field, you know, because it's not just my knowledge on this journey at United Way, but it's the rest of my philanthropic partners to understand what are the needs going to be going forward. I keep telling the team it's progress, not perfection. We have to push against the fact that we have to be perfect in this moment, right? But we have to make progress. No action is not okay at this point in time. And so for us, you know, we had been in this place around child well-being, moved to the space where the COVID response was a really critical and demonstrated a different kind of partnership collaboration in our community. And also then decided that it was important, an important moment in time with the killing of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta to launch a United for Racial Equity and Healing Fund for our community. And, you know, I would have never imagined that would have been here. Like if I had in my wildest dreams, what I imagined all the change work excuse me, that I would be doing, I couldn't have imagined this moment, right? But the reality is we could not do it, right? We had to invest, and not just with our words, but with skin in the game. So United Way committed $1 million to it. We obviously are working to increase that with resources from other donors, but we've got to take people on the journey with us, right? Because this is the moment in time that it requires. You know, I'll just say to you, I think one of the questions you asked is what is the toll that it takes on us? It's a lot. I'm tired. You know, when Toya and I were talking about this, I have my bouts of mental exhaustion that are real, but I recognize that we are in this moment and this is when the leadership counts, right? Because we cannot go back to what used to be. We have to redesign a better system for all those families who are struggling right now. And so we are in these seats, and I recognize the power of that. You know, I have to balance that with making sure that I am also thinking about that rebellious part of taking care, that self-care part. But I think that, you know, for us in United Way, it's a journey. It's messy work. You know, I by no means will tell you we have it perfectly. Sometimes we're going to make mistakes. But the reality is that this is the moment in time to lean in. And for us, we are leaning in all the way. And quite frankly, my community impact work is now really becoming the transformation across the organization, right? From HR to all the other functions, which, you know, is transformational in and of itself, but it really demonstrates what the power of that kind of leadership can do to a system. And quite frankly, a 100-plus-year-old organization that 90% of the dollars went only to direct services and didn't think about systems in that way.
But so many questions have come into my mind right now. And Chanda, I want to give you a chance to answer the question, but I want you all to think about or hear some of the things going through my head. So for example, Katrina, your organization, the United Way of Greater Atlanta, is the only one among the three of you that is led by a person of color. The other thing that is popping up into my mind when you talked about exhaustion is that you have multiple dimensions within your lives. You know, there are kids who are in your homes right now as you are having this conversation with me. You mentioned mistakes as well. Do we sometimes put pressure on ourselves that because we are Black in these privileged positions with this power in this time, that we've got to get it all right? And so how do we navigate also, and what constitutes a mistake? Have you ever had community pushback? So that was a lot, but now you know how my brain is. I don't know if we'll get to all of that, but those were all of the issues that have just turned up for me thus far. So Chanda.
Yeah, you know, so when you asked the question, you know, I was just responding in all kinds of ways. And I guess I'll start with the way that I that my body was responding.
Mhm.
And, you know, and that is with, you know, great sadness. I think we're collectively in grief. We're grieving the lives of many that have been lost. I think that we're worried holistically around people in our communities. We know who are being impacted by COVID-19. We have our young Black men being videotaped in their deaths that are being played repeatedly. We have community that is sick and tired of being sick and tired. And we have leaders that are sick and tired at every single level. And so it is a time of great disruption. It is a time of great uncertainty. And it is challenging to be in a role of leadership, right? A positional role in which your community, the broader community, are looking to you for answers in a time that is really, as Zora Neale Hurston says, it's a year that has more questions than answers. Mm-hmm. And I think that the weight of that is real. The weight of responsibility is something that I believe Black women, especially Black men, need to be mindful of, because that weight comes in all kinds of ways and shapes. And I think that, you know, for me, it's not so much, I have such a responsibility. I feel such a responsibility to the community. And so when I need a day off, when I need to take a break, I have to release this idea that I'm failing or I'm not leaning all the way in. And that's a real thing that I am struggling with. And I'm getting to the point of like, my mantra right now is like, I'm going to do my best. I'm gonna show up every day and do my best. And that's gonna look different every single day. That I'm in a place, in a space where I need people to check on me. And I have people on my list that I'm checking on, because, you know, this is a make or break moment for a lot of us. This is where you can hit the wall and not be able to come back from it. And I just want to like identify all of the things that are coming in and hitting hard. I'm here in Minneapolis where George Floyd was murdered. The evidence of that every single day. I wake up thinking about it. You know, I have 4 sons that are experiencing that grief, that trauma, and their friends and their family. We've got police reform going. There's abolitionists that, you know, as crime is surging in the midst of a pandemic, there's rallies. And we know that not just the frontline workers, but the frontline activists that are out there trying to make our communities and our world more just and right, are putting their lives on the line to protect other lives, right? They're getting into good trouble, as John Lewis said. You know, they're out there marching and protecting and saying enough is enough. You know, it is a moment to behold. It's a moment for us, I think, that will be documented, and we are either going to be on the right side or the wrong side. And I take that very seriously. I think that in terms of the work of the foundation and how I'm leaning in, I think for me, this question culminates all the other questions, right? Like I need the sisterhood. I need the people that have come before. I need the people that are coming behind in terms of age. And, but I'm also really clear that there have been conditions that have been set. There's been leadership that I have been transitioning into, meaning that everywhere I go, I'm combating anti-Blackness, whether or not it's systemic or whether or not it's individual, whether or not it's directed at me, whether or not it's directed at my colleague. I am stepping into combating anti-Blackness every day I show up. Every morning my feet hit the floor. And so that has manifested itself in the work that I have done at the Minneapolis Foundation, where for sure over their 100+ years, they have done work in community. And I would say that we're stepping that up in a number of ways. You know, part of the condition of me coming over to the foundation is that I have to work on community level violence and I have to work on criminal justice reform. So I brought that with me at the end of in September of 2017 is when I stepped into this. You know, I laugh at that and I tell people some days I feel old, but I feel young in philanthropy. And so I'm like, I don't know if I'm emerging or if I've arrived, right? But
I think you've arrived. If you'd like a little feedback, I think you've arrived.
You know, so I mean, it's just, but it's a great place to be, right? To feel like the teacher and the student. And so we really took our time on that. And we had some fierce debates. And I remember my CEO, white, as you pointed out, former mayor 3 times, R.T. Ryback, we had a conversation and he's like, you know, we need to get back to this place of Minnesota exceptionalism. And, you know, I'm sitting there and he's like, okay, so it's clear that you are not with me right now. Like, what are you thinking? I'm like, what has been exceptional? Who has it been exceptional to and for? And, you know, when can we get to that conversation? Like, you know, everybody wants to talk about when we all thrive. Are you willing to do the work for all of us to thrive? Are you willing to come up against the systems, the unions, the whatever it is that have been these sacred cows that in many ways have protected the status quo, in many ways that have eliminated all of the opportunities for people of color, people that look like me? Are we willing to do the hard work? Right? Like, let's just have that conversation. Let me understand where we're willing to take risk and where we're not, because I need to wholeheartedly, for me to be in this place, I have to believe we're doing that work. And as a result, you know, I have to tell you, our values evolved from integrity and community and words like that to words like equity is a responsibility, proximity is necessary, hope is essential. And I am standing in work that I know that I've influenced. I'm standing in a work that was collective. I'm standing in work that embeds the voice of community. And I'm standing in work in a framework that I believe will get our foundation to the next step, knowing that there's still room for us to be bolder and more intentional. And, you know, some of the things that, you know, we have directly done that has evolved and manifested itself through that framework and through, frankly, you know, my doggedness and other people's doggedness. And I think what the times demand that have set us up to respond in a more responsible way to what we're facing right now with COVID-19 and with George Floyd. And so one of those things is a new convening strategy, which includes a podcast that I lead at the foundation. And it's called Conversations with Chanda. It's a convening. And that was very much about, we need to have some different conversations. And we get into things where people are like, we're tired of talking. We need to get to action. And I am completely convinced, and the foundation is completely convinced, that we have not been having the right conversations at the right tables. That we might be talking about things, but we're not being honest. We're not getting down to brass tacks. We are talking about issues of race and economics and class, but we're doing that in communities that we're already comfortable with. But to be able to talk about things in a cross-racial way that really get to what the things that we say later, like, let's put them on the table. And so that's what we're working on. It's been a successful undertaking. And it also is a place that I feel quite vulnerable, right? And I tell people the first 2 conversations, you know, I'm talking about white fragility and decolonizing wealth. We're talking about the impact of the criminal justice system. And, you know, here I am talking in front of white audiences about things that are deeply personal to me and many people that look like me and have been marginalized and minimized in the places and the spaces that they've been in. We have developed funds, new funds, One Minneapolis Fund that is there to respond to the emergent issues in community. And so it was seeded with $1 million focused on supporting BIPOC organizations. And we were able to activate that very quickly in COVID and getting $1 million, almost $2 million now out the door. We've been able to get another $1 million out the door to support Black business owners, BIPOC business owners in businesses that were destroyed in the rioting. The Fund for Safe Communities, how do we address community violence and police violence and reform. That fund was established 2 years ago, and who would have thought that we would need it in the way that we need it now? And who would have thought that our donors that have never donated in that space would be willing to contribute in that space and allow us to have the impact that we're having? And I have to say, it's because of centering the needs of our Black community in a way that, again, feels vulnerable but necessary. Two other things I want to add is that, you know, we are, this journey has not been easy. And we are also part of collaboratives in which we are bringing others along or making bold statements. And so in a partnership with Lalit and Rapad locally, that Nexus Community Partners and the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, the three of us, Black leaders, came together and said, we're gonna put out a joint statement and help move a joint statement on combating anti-Blackness and moving towards justice. And we did that and got 24 local philanthropies to sign on to that statement. We are looking to establish an combating anti-Blackness fund, $25 million to get work out specifically to do that. And that's a bold statement. We've got other organizations that are coming into the fold looking to look at police reforms and others. And we started that work before George Floyd. But George Floyd, on the tail of COVID, is something to be living through. And I think that many of us that have been trailing, you know, along and trying to figure out where we can influence, how we can influence, how do we get over the hurdles, are now being confronted with white people, frankly, that are waking up to the issue in the new way. And sometimes there are white people that have been alongside of us that have been progressive and they just knew they knew. And now they're aware that they did not know, and that, you know, they're apologetic, or they're at least more open to understanding more deeply how they can be more of an ally. And then we have other people that are just like, I had no idea. And in all of those circumstances, they are looking to us to help navigate that space. And that's a responsibility that is on top of and on top of and on top of everything else that we're navigating. But there's an opportunity in this moment that I hope that we fully seize, that we bring our full voices in, because this is a moment in which people are listening. They're listening. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I kind of, my experience is interesting because we are not quite where you all are in Minneapolis, but yet our board had adopted a strategic framework, and that was a whole process through which I can say that I truly influenced ensuring that equity became a core value of the foundation, and pushing for a change in our mission statement that grounded justice in the mission statement. So we adopted these things. We adopted a new mission. We adopted core values of the foundation, which for the first time named equity. I would say when I arrived 6 years ago, we literally had board members who did not even want to say the word equity or have that expressed in a board meeting.
Or even understanding, Carmen, the difference between equality and equity.
And equity.
Okay.
Saw it as socialism. And therefore, that just wasn't what we were about. And some of those members are still on the board, but they've come along. So it's one thing to adopt the language. Now, in terms of like doing the work, it's interesting. We had our former president, his and this is Albert Reska, his way of operating as a Southern Community Foundation president was, let's do the work and ask for forgiveness later. So in terms of the actual work that we've been doing, that we've invested in, that programmatically where the work has been, it it's grounded and steeped in that. Where the disconnect has been in the foundation's voice and leadership being matched with the work that has happened. And in order to have the foundation's voice and leadership at the forefront or matching the work, you have to have your board with you. You have to bring the board along, and the leadership has to be bold. That's my view. And I would say our current president's view is we have to bring these people along. And how do we be gentle enough or say the things that need to be said in a way that would establish a level of comfort to bring these folks along?
I hear you.
You know, I'm wondering, that
I hear you.
raises, yeah, and that raises something for me. The word exhaustion again, coming up. Is a part of the exhaustion the effort that it takes to, in fact, not move forward? It's not the run, but the holding, the energy it takes to hold back, to make other people comfortable.
You know, one of the things that I've said is that the hardest thing about my work is self-editing, right? It's the strategy before I open my mouth. And I think we've talked about, Ms. Gladys telling people like, here's how you get there, but like, here's how you might want to say it at the table. And I think this idea of shaping and editing is part of the exhaustion. Yeah. I'm sorry, Katrina, you were going to say something.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think the exhaustion is also trying to hold space for all of this, right? Like it's the work, right? To Carmen's point. So the team is doing the right work and then bringing all these other people along. So you mentioned, Lauren, that my CEO is a Black man. Milton and I have had the, pleasure of having to work together in previous life at the National Urban League. He's been at this United Way for over 10 years. But there has not been a moment where he was able to be able to name race in this way, right? And to do the work that, he knew was the right work to do. And so it's navigating that. He actually just today kind of released an opinion piece in the AJC about that experience as a Black man in the seats that he sits in corporate America and all across, and at this moment in time, why it's important to step into this moment. And we've had to bring the board along. I mean, quite frankly, getting to a racial equity fund with $1 million commitment meant that the board had to come along, right? And they're at the beginning part of their journey, but quite frankly, it took leadership to be able to push folks along, bring folks along. Our board chair and my board liaison have been open to studying and learning as white allies. And so they've had to do their own work. And that led us to being a part of a racial equity cohort with United Way Worldwide and doing some things that, quite frankly, a year or so ago we wouldn't have done. We had a State of the Children breakfast around child well-being, had a guest speaker talk about systemic racism, and we had several donors walk out the room, right? Who were like, what are you all talking about? Where is United? Why are we doing this? And so, for me, the discomfort is okay, because we can't get to change without that discomfort. But it does mean that this education and awareness is still a part of the journey. And I hear you, Chanda. I think, when we started the fund, I went back and forth on, do I really have to be in this education space? Like, is that what we have to be doing? But we have to. I think now folks are listening in a different way, open to hearing. You're more progressive. Folks are saying, oh, I didn't realize this. Oh, and I didn't realize you were experiencing this. And now I've got to do some work and not depend on you to help educate me, right? But I do think that we have this moment in time, but that exhaustion means that all three of us and four of us are holding space for so much, right? On top of our teams, on top of, juggling, trying to figure out for myself, school starts on Monday and I have to be a homeschool mom and a leader and hold my team space. And quite frankly, when everything happened with Rayshard Brooks and Ahmaud Arbery, my staff was grieving. They were in pain every single day. And I could not go on as business as usual, just continuing to do the grant making and responding to the needs of community, I also had to hold space for my team. And so I chose to have somebody come and help because it was draining on me, to do that. And so I had a colleague of mine in the philanthropy space come and hold some healing circle work with my team, because we can't get just pushed past that. Like, those are real emotions and feelings. So, it is us all trying to hold space and try to help. I feel like some days I have a mountain on my shoulder because I'm shifting and changing so much, but it's having ripple effects across the whole organization that I didn't anticipate when I took this job. I always say, Ethan, you didn't tell me that this was part of my job too, but I also had to be in that space also. And I hear you about the self-editing. I think every day I'm trying to figure out how to do that with grace and rebellion and be very authentic about who I am.
I think for me, it's the self-editing, it's being authentic, and it's managing anger and understanding truly the harm that's being done and communicating the harm. Because and in no way am I making light of George Taylor, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Sterling, any of the numerous names that we know and that we don't know. But it's easy. I have found that the white folks that I work with are more willing to be vocal and take a stand against outright terrible, egregious acts of hate, but it's the stuff that happens on the daily. It is the slow moving disasters of poverty and the injustice that is all around us to really do what it has to do what needs to be done to deal with that. Takes a level of courage and commitment that when you were talking, Chanda, about, are we really truly willing to do the hard work? Are we willing to do that? For me, we're launching an equity fund. And to just talk about equity and injustice and so on and so forth, to get to naming racial equity, to get to saying investing in Black organizations or Black leadership, to be able to say those words and not just people of color. I mean, these are the challenges. And I honestly have been in an interesting space of asking, just trying to not only be in this, but also to step back and observe, to be a very careful observer of what is happening and be deliberate about what my role is in this time. And I'm doing a 21-day meditation with a circle of women. And this is Deepak Chopra's 21-day meditation for abundance. And one of those things is to put it out there, to set your intention and to just trust the universe. You set the intention and you let it go. And part of that has been instructive for me, even in this process of giving feedback and helping to shape this equity agenda. And being clear about my purpose and my role, but holding space for all these different things. I wanted to say to you, Katrina, or I think it was Chanda, I sat with a friend this past weekend who is a psychiatrist. She's a very renowned psychiatrist in our area, Dr. Denise Shervington, and she was asking me how I was doing, how I was coming through this whole time. And I said, well, I had my mother with me for 4.5 months. My daughter's home. I have my team. I was responsible for my mom. I'm responsible for my children. My two sons are in 2 different places, thinking through them and responsible for my team of 12 people. And she said to me, who made you responsible? And with that question, we talked about how much we take on and how we see ourselves in these moments.
When you're saying we, is that inherent to Black women? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, as Black women, how much we take on. And I think what has been my savings grace through this time, and it took me a moment to get there. I was not there in the first easily 2.5 months of this, was to go back to my practices of self-care and grounding medication. You almost see my calendar over here, but I had to schedule it. I had to put it in color and hold to keeping that space for me, but also opening and creating that space and regular check-in time with my team. I played with Sweet Honey and the Rock, who believe in the dream cannot. And that's how we started our time together. Because you're right, they're grieving. I have people who've lost people and who are bearing friends, who are pallbearers. And this is a lot to hold if we don't allow ourselves to be loving and kind and send that to each other.
Yeah. Can I add one thing? Because we talked a little bit about all the roles that we have, and Toya knows, and a few people know, but my mom came home for hospice care 2 days before the George Floyd murder, and she passed away 6 weeks ago. So I have been sometimes, and a lot of times, we are going through so much, and we have developed a practice that I don't know is healthy of showing up like nothing is going on underneath. And I have had these moments, I've had probably 3 of them in my leadership, where the pain of what I was going through was so much that it just showed up. And I think I'm in that moment now where, I lost my mom. Like, I was caring for her while I was caring for community and like doing all these things. And I recognize that this is not an uncommon story. Right. And I recognize my need to just slow down a little bit. And it's not just self-care, but it's how I interact with other people, knowing and just making it a matter of fact that there's something else that's going on that I need to be mindful of. Again, it's a moment where I'm like, I'm holding as much as I can in the way that I can, and I'm just going to do my best. But I think in any conversation about Black women and how they're leading, I can't help but at least in this moment, mention the importance of my mom and how she set me on a path of strong faith and commitment to the community.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you to say her name.
Terry Ann.
Thank you. Thank you for that. As I listen to you, I think about what Carmen just said about who made you responsible. And there's a distinction between being responsible to and being responsible for. And as you're slowing down, you're actually being responsible to them by caring about how you pace yourself in some ways, as opposed to jumping in and expending all that energy that we can so often be quick to do to fix things right now, right away. Katrina, I saw you wanted to say something, and I want to give you a couple of topics that I could go on for hours. At first I was like, an hour and a half, that's enough time. I could do this all day long. I wish I were going to be at the retreat with you and that we were going to be in person this year. But I'm also thinking about whether there is ever pushback from community. You're not doing enough. You're not doing it fast enough, not being bold enough, or around the question of mistakes. I also want to talk about community violence, the uptick. In Colorado, we lost 9 young people who had not yet reached adulthood, so under the age of 18 and 11 days. And certainly in Atlanta, there's been a fair amount of attention to that. You referenced it as well, Chanda. But Katrina, weigh in on this. And then I want to talk about women and funding women as well and women leadership in community.
Yeah, I mean, I think
In about 20 minutes.
for me, I think this is what I think, Chanda, and I think what you elevated so much is about giving ourselves grace. And so, you know, I think there is definitely this pressure around this sense of urgency, which for me is very rooted in white supremacist kind of nature, that it has to, one, be perfect, and two, that it has to be done right now. So I am always pushing against that, right? Against that for my team, for myself, because this moment we're in is going to be here for a while, right? Like, we are still in response. I don't even know when we can talk about the word recovery, because we're still in very deep response. So one, it is about the grace. You know, I, like Carmen, you know, had to figure out what are the structures I need and how do I hold myself accountable to taking care of me and being present for my family, right? My husband, my children. And that to me has had to be a critical part of structuring my day. How do I break those blocks? Don't start before 10. At 4 o'clock, I end and take the kids to the pool. In the afternoon, I have time to check in with them, their homeschool. But also to be able to, you know, I have other supports. So I have a coach that I've been working with, who I meet with on a regular basis, because I can't do it by myself, right? I've had the luxury of being a part of Rockwood Leadership's National, their equity and philanthropy. And it just came at the right time where I was able to leave room. It's okay for me to be, and I don't need to be on till 8, 9 o'clock at night. Like, that doesn't work. And so, you know, I think we have to also push back against that, right? Because it's very easy to slip right back into that, because it's going to be a crisis, right? There's always this moment where everybody's going to need us at this point in time. The other piece to it, to me, is to be honest and vulnerable. So, you know, there have been moments where my team, where I'm not hiding the fact that I'm struggling trying to figure out how, like everyone else, how I'm going to manage homeschooling my children for the next 9 weeks in an environment where my job is requiring so much of me, right? So there's times when I have to take a step back. There's times when I need to take a break. And so, you know, I think, Lauren, some of this is we're going to have to continue to give ourselves grace, and do it and do the thing, right? Because if we don't do it, we will not be here. You know, there's so many Black women who, when I say mental exhaustion, I'm clear about it, but so many women who, quite frankly, who, you know, are organizing and doing all the work on the front, that I don't know how they're going to be healthy and maintain and see us into 2021 if we continue in this manner.
It's often been said that movements rest on the backs of Black women, and Black Lives Matter, people often forget, began with Black women, queer women, as a part of that as well. And similarly, Pride, Me Too, you know, women who have lifted up voice, vision, and value and movements, and then are often forgotten. So as a women's fund, Chanda, you're also on the board of the Women's Fund in Minnesota. What can we do? Teresa Younger's Ms. Foundation just released a report, Pocket Change, and how women and girls of color do more with less, 0.5% of foundation giving going specifically. And Novo Foundation has just pulled back or announced that it is in the process of pulling back some significant resources that made up the funding of that 0.5%. Talk about any strategies. And this is not, I don't raise this at the expense of our men who are hurting, who are dying, who are incarcerated, but looking at all of the gifts as well as the hurts, not just the disparities and the deficits, but also the gifts. But women right now, in the time of COVID and of the racial unrest and the lifting of that veil, we are mourning our men, we're kneeling in the streets, we're burying these men, and at the same time, are on the predominance of jobs on the front lines, or those who have lost jobs in hospitality or retail, making a way out of no way, with the presumption that we will be strong enough to carry on. So what can we do to build a narrative around women and Black women in these times, as well as our sisters of Black, Indigenous, and people of color as well?
We have to lift their stories. Here we have, for every white woman that dies as a result of childbirth or labor, we have 4 Black women. And that was prior to COVID. And, you know, as we are talking with our F3Cs, especially what this is looking like for women who are going through the process of labor alone, unattended, in a system that has not dealt with its racism, it's quite frightening. And then if you add language barriers on top of that, we learned of a story of a Latina who was having a very difficult labor, and not one person who attended her spoke Spanish. And she had a C-section and not understood what was happening to her. That thought is frightening, and it's just wrong. And I think that we have to lift up these stories and encourage and nurture that collective power that we were talking about at the beginning of this call, what philanthropy is. I mean, this is a major moment for what's being called legacy charities to reform and to change themselves. But this is also a moment for us to think differently about our collective power as women, for us to be able to change situations as we understand them, experience them, and know how to do. So I think it's a critical moment to lift these stories so that people understand. Like, for instance, we've been giving grants to individuals as well as to nonprofits. We have impacted about 1,400 or so families throughout our region who've been impacted by COVID. And reading the stories of the folks who are applying for funding, going through that process, and for my staff, I mean, quite frankly, they're experiencing secondary trauma going through and reading these stories. But reading the story of a woman who has 3 children, she's pregnant with her 4th, and she makes $9,000 a year working full time. That, I mean, we have to understand that economic security and working full time in a restaurant, you know, this is what she's doing, and she's a single head of household. This, in terms of the reality of what so many women are faced with across this country, trying to make ends meet. And they are the mothers of sons, as you were speaking. They are the wives, the girlfriends, the significant others. And we find that we understand clearly that when you secure and help a woman be safe and well, you are securing that whole family.
As we talk about philanthropy and the role of philanthropy in all of this, AbbVie, of course, just recently released its platform. It's Points for Change for Philanthropy, which, if our viewers have not yet seen, I hope that they will do so. Katrina?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think what I would add is just continuing to really think about how we lift up these nonprofit leaders, and particularly Black women who are leading nonprofits, who are doing all kinds of work, from policy work to direct service work to, you know, really thinking about the civic engagement space. You know, I think that has to be something that's core. You know, I've been amazed to listen to the stories of Black women. We have a Black woman who is leading the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative, right? And she's focusing on small businesses. And as she's growing her work, you know, the amount of small businesses and Black businesses specifically who are suffering in our city and across the region is inordinate, right? But the overwhelming pressure for her to help respond immediately and with that need is important. So continuing to provide general operating support for her organization to thrive through this moment, I think is going to be important, and so many like her. You know, like Carmen, I think, you know, we have a huge challenge around undocumented families and mixed status families and their ability to, you know, access resources. Quite frankly, that is astounding. And as we get to this rental eviction space, it's going to be something that we've had to pay attention to. But, you know, there are a number of women, Latino women leaders who are really trying to address some of the mental health trauma and needs. And we have to lift them up. We have to lift their voices up, but we have to continue to support them with the resources that are going to allow them to sustain their leadership through this time. And so, you know, the only last thing I'll say, and I think it's something that I don't know quite yet what that looks like, but this mental health space for many of our leaders is really important to me, and particularly women who are juggling, caring for others, mothers, etc. Is something that I am really concerned about. You know, to me right now has been the anecdotal stories of leaders who come to me every day with the level of exhaustion and having to hold, you know, do I open up my childcare facility tomorrow? And how do I make sure I don't have to lay off half of my staff and do the work that I have to do every day, right? And so, you know, I think there's a place here for us to think about how we support leaders and women leaders who, you know, are on the front lines, and Black women who are not only a obligation to their job, but it's a moral obligation to their community to do work, that are stressed beyond measure in this moment.
I think it's important as we are here now in Zoom, also to recognize our privilege, not only of our positions, but we are obviously safe, we are housed, we have food, we have, even under the most difficult of circumstances, some element of choice and opportunity. And I think that that awareness is also a part of what drives us. But we need to be clear about that privilege that we hold as well. Katrina, I'm just going to ask you to reflect for a moment when I mentioned the deaths, the murders of these young people. Just speak to me about that, about any sort of analysis or response. I mean, that heartbreak on top of all the other heartbreaks that we have said, those ancient tears that we keep crying over and over and over again. But these, you know, 7-year-olds, 14, whatever it may be. Talk to me about that, because Atlanta has certainly had.
Yeah, you know, it has been, you know, one of the things that I think we have underestimated in our community is the trauma that young people are experiencing and witnessing every day. And I'm going to take it from a point where, you know, my children are 11, boy and girl. They've witnessed things, and we've had to have conversations about this for a very long time for an 11-year-old to even wrap their head around. That I think we, you know, one, have to make sure we prioritize that youth voice in this. So much of this work is done around young people instead of with them, right? And with their voices at the center. And I think that's the misstep, right? This moment is telling us that, one, they are being affected by what they're watching in what's happening and experiencing in their communities, which quite frankly is now just being publicized, quite frankly, right? Because we can see it on, you know, on Instagram and all kinds of other things, but it's things that communities have been struggling with. And so I think one of the solutions that we have to make sure that young people are at the center of this. You know, when we started and looked at this racial equity fund, it would have been really easy to just you know, not think about young people in this. And so, you know, my team prioritized youth voice. You know, it had to be a part of how we think about who are the organizations we support, the nascent organizations, not your traditional youth serving organizations necessarily, but really pushing to make sure that young people are at the center of it. The second piece would be, even in the solutions we're trying to, you know, determine in the city, a lot of the work has been done with adults, right? And so the generational gap for us is that we have to talk to young people, and we got to release that power, right? And understand that they have solutions that may not be what we think are the right things to do, but we've got to support them, because quite frankly, all the movement building and all the work that happened in the city of Atlanta was young people, young adults who were organizing, and millions of people out in the streets protesting. And so, I think it is a shift. It is a shift in power to allow and to hold the fact that young people have a voice in this. I'm going to have to shape this, but it also means we have to traditionally rethink our models of what youth engagement look like, how we prioritize youth voice, and even what that looks like, because quite frankly, they're not in schools right now. So we're going to have to be super creative in terms of how we utilize the channels. But they have to be at the center of this. This can't be a change that happens without young people, but that adults make decisions that don't include them. So I think for me, that's where this sits with us. Do I know that that's work? Absolutely. It means we all got to rethink how we do things, but it has to be at the forefront of what we do in all that we do, including the philanthropic work we do. Like, how do young people show up to help make decisions, because they are part of the decision-making process as well.
We're having the same kind of rise in violence and just violence, period, in New Orleans, as well as abuse throughout our region. Our nonprofits, especially those with social workers who are working in the field, who are recounting such high increases in abuse, in domestic abuse, in incest. You have children and young people being left in the care of other folks and other family members, and just trying to wade through this when we have such a high demand and yet an incredible shortfall of resources on the mental health and the behavioral health side. We knew prior to COVID that the number one need in our school system was support for trauma and for social emotional learning. Children, we have given, just in the aftermath of Katrina, we're coming up on this 15-year anniversary, but we now have generational trauma that our young people are dealing with that's unresolved. It's unresolved. So this issue of how we support and are very intentional about behavioral and mental health at this time it's just critical. And Katrina, I just wanted to add, in terms of support for those leaders, for instance, we wanted to do a check, and we did a nonprofit study here looking at the impact of COVID on our local nonprofits. And we had about 750 nonprofits in that pool that were participating in that. And then one of the follow-ups that we did was trying to help nonprofits access the PPP loan, and making sure that nonprofits led by people of color were accessing that loan. And if we just took it from that, these several nonprofits got this loan and checked it off, they're led by people of color, they got the PPP, but then in dialing that back and talking to those leaders to say, well, yes, I got the PPP loan, I'm able to pay my staff, but I haven't been at full salary since March. Or one woman said since January, because we were struggling before COVID hit. So our leaders are stressed, they are strained, and operating support is critical. But I think that this is a moment we can think out the box for how we can give relief and support for things like respite, or for them to take care of their mental health. Might be hard to convince folks to take a sabbatical in the midst of this, but what are the things that they can do to care for their mental health and the health of their staffs at this moment?
Yeah. Can I jump in for a minute? And I just want to acknowledge that there's an emergency response across the street from my house right now for a woman that lives there. So I'm trying to manage noise a little bit, but just to the uptick of violence, we've had a surge of violence here in Minneapolis as well. And we've had a number of young people that have both been the victim and the perpetrator. And I do think that there are a couple of things that are happening, which includes the mental health status, but I think that there's been a disinvestment of after school programming across the board and a shift to workforce. And I just think that we have to take care of the continuum of age and know that those safe spaces for young people in those early years are very important to preventing violence later. And we're seeing a manifestation of a number of things that are happening, and it's a great concern. I think we're at almost 400 shootings, which is like really something we probably have not seen since the 90s here in Minneapolis, and young people getting shot or killed. The centering of youth voice, I just want to mention, I talked earlier about the Fund for Safe Communities that we established at the Minneapolis Foundation in 2018, really after the Parkland shooting and watching the leadership of those young people come forward. And I have established an advisory of young people, largely under 25, that are advising me and the decisions in that fund. They're reviewing the fund. I had them over the other day in the yard for a distance advisory meeting and saying, you know, look, we've got stuff that's happening in the street. I need to understand it. What do you know? What do you think the interventions are? Who are some of the perpetrators that you think I need to talk to? You know, who is getting out of it? Like, help me understand, and how can we communicate the needs and the interventions required? And so what I have to say, and Katrina, I've really appreciated the perfection, not perfect, because the work that we're leading is not perfect. But I have to say that I'm in a situation where even when maybe our board wasn't quite ready, they've had a high degree of trust in the leadership of our team at the foundation that are allowing us to step into things more boldly. And there was definitely moments of like, who are we listening to? Are we listening? Like, are we providing leadership? Are we listening to everyone in the community? Like, how are we centering? And one of the other components of our strategic framework is amplifying the voice and leadership of others. And that is also a skill set to suspend your own opinion, to be able to create really an authentic space in which their voices are leading in that way. Ms. Lauren, you made me think a bit about, I have definitely centered the voices of people of color in our work and how we're devising strategy. I do not, as specifically and as pointedly as we could, have that gender lens. And so I think just in asking that question and just flagging that for me and thinking about it, and the thing I reflected on was, you know, while it's not been as intentional as it could be, the number of women that are leading organizations and leading the movements and at the grassroots level, at the civic engagement, the way that they're engaging, certainly those are organizations that we're supporting, but we have not talked about the intersectionality of what that looks like in my work at the foundation, in my work as a trustee at the Women's Foundation. Of course we have. But it is a great reminder to be mindful of that.
Well, we are almost out of time, and I know that, or we may be out of time, and I know we're going to lose Carmen in just a moment. I can't remember which one of you early on, when we were talking about what is philanthropy and when we were naming some of our sheroes within the field. And it was referenced, I think it's appropriate to come back full circle, that Toya leads with love. And because Toya is the inspiration for voice, vision, and value, and who gave me the distinct pleasure of being with the three of you today. I'd also like to acknowledge that Valeda Fullwood, the author of Giving Back, describes that for her, philanthropy is not just the love of humankind, which I've often said, which is the definition that one might see, but also the love of what it means to be human. And what I have seen in each of you is truly the embodiment of that. And I am grateful that as I come to the latter part of my career, it fills my spirit and fills my soul to to spend time with you as you will continue the work that will never end, is the truth. It will never end. So I'd like to give you a few moments to very briefly, before Carmen just kind of goes dark and leaves, because you have a meeting in about 6 minutes, another meeting, to pick one of the words, voice, vision, or value, and just say a couple of words to close this out. Black women leading philanthropy, voice, vision, and value. And thank you again, Toya.
The word that's speaking to me is voice. And, you know, I think I expressed it earlier, is that there's an opportunity right now for us to lead in our full voice, to bring our full selves to the table. I think that, you know, across the board, people are trying to figure out what is happening, and, you know, and how can they help, and how can things be different. And we hold a lot of wisdom. We hold a lot of power in this moment. And I just really am thinking a lot about, how do I lead in full voice?
Thank you. Carmen.
Black women leading in philanthropy. I'll focus on value. And I would say understanding our unique value to this field and respecting that value for ourselves, as well as nurturing, understanding the value that our community has in its promise, and making sure that we can fully resource our community in a way that it has what it needs to realize its full potential, to truly thrive, to truly overcome, and to address all the multitude of things that we've talked about. For people to truly, I loved as Chanda was talking about the real work that needs to be done. We hold that. We hold that very near and dear to our hearts. And to me, that is the value that we bring to this work. This isn't a game. It's not a job. We're not here to play. We are in this because this is very real and sits with us, with our daughters, with our mothers, with our loved ones, our aunties, our uncles, our sons, our cousins. We are inextricably wrapped in this experience, and there's value in what we bring to this work, to what we give it, and more so what can come because.
Thank you. Katrina.
Yes, I guess they left me with vision. So I think
You had a choice, you can repeat.
no, it's okay. I think vision is it. I think, you know, for me, Black women in philanthropy, and if I think all the way back to my grandmother and great grandmother and our ancestors and women who came before us, they had the vision that this was gonna be different, right? Like, and we could not have imagined any of the things all of us experience, but they are on our shoulders. And I think that vision that they wanted better for us, our children, our children's children, and others' children, I think is what I hold, right? And that vision that we lead with hope, healing, and care for our community and for others, I think is a huge part of it. I also think that, you know, that vision is what has allowed all of the things to happen around social movements of our time. You know, if you look back to history, the vision of women who were behind the scenes doing the work that had to get done is what has allowed things to change. And so, you know, I think we're at the heart of that, right? And that is where I feel like Black women lead, whether it's in the front in formal roles or in informal roles. It is the fact that we have had the vision, and, you know, some of that comes with our ancestors. We are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I believe that wholeheartedly. And I think that is where that vision comes from.
Well, you matter. Black Lives Matter. I just wish you traveling mercies, perhaps, is what I will leave us with at this point in time as you move forward with the rest of your day and in the context of your work, your families, your communities, yourselves, and your whole beings. So to each of you, again, blessings and gratitude. And I look forward to the day when the virtual hug I'm sending you right now, a real one, even with the mask on. And I thank Toya once again, and thank you to all of you who have joined us for this wonderful opportunity to hear Carmen Randolph, Chanda Raker, Katrina Mitchell, and their voices of vision and value. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
All right, thank you.